Today, I am talking to Shannon Chamberlain. Shannon was formerly at St. John's College. She is an expert in the 18th century. She knows a lot about Adam Smith, Jane Austen, and all those good people. And she's also written a mystery novel. Shannon, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Okay, first question. What is a novel?
Oh, boy. The 18th century tried really hard to figure this out, too. There are a lot of definitions of one. And I would say that my favorite is just a long prose fictional narrative. And yeah, I think one of the most interesting things for me about studying 18th century literature was that they were trying to work this out at the time. It was a new form. It was something that was considered a bit scandalous. It featured characters who were not real but could have been real. And I think that was basically where, somebody like Samuel Richardson landed.
So all these debates about when the novel begins, when it doesn't begin, what exactly it is, we're just overthinking this and we need to throw all that out.
I think so. It's like one of our Supreme Court justices says, he knows when he sees it.
So if I say, like, when's the first English novel? That's a fake question to you.
I think it's just not a very interesting question.
Uh-huh.
It's like any form, it takes a while to develop. There are variations on it. There's all sorts of ways to tell a story like that. I would say that for me, one of the essential characteristics, though, is that one that Richardson proposed, that it has to involve characters who are not real but could be.
So we don't see it bursting onto the scene with Defoe.
I think that there's Defoe's an interesting transitional figure. He definitely is moving in that direction. Robinson Crusoe could have been real, but there's something a little bit allegorical still. Still about Robinson Crusoe or Journal of Plague Year or something like that. There's something about the characters that are not they're not self-contained in the way that Richardson's characters are.
So, and he's closer to Swift.
I would say he's closer to Swift. I would say that, he and Swift were in a bit of a dialogue.
Yeah.
And, although Gulliver for me does have something more of the real about him than the allegorical. Even though obviously the journey he's taking is in a way very referential to outside ideas and sort of fabulistic ones at that.
I think ambivalence is very important to the idea of the novel. And there's a lot more ambivalence in Swift than in Defoe, I think.
Mm-hmm. You mean ambivalence about, what Gulliver's relation is to all of these things that he sees and, the sort of impact it has on him?
So I think a novel, there's something ambivalent about most novels in that there is clearly a moral perspective that the novel takes. But in order for that to be convincing, the novelist has to put in all the other antithetical or oppositional perspectives and do so quite convincingly. So if we take an easy example in Jane Austen, clearly she's not on the side of Willoughby, but the novel has to sustain a certain ambivalence towards Willoughby in order for us to be convinced and for us to partake of the argument and for us to sort of, be persuadable by Austen about her ultimate aim. So it's not quite like what Helen Vendler says about a poem, which is that the poem just is always thinking and never concluding. But there has to be something of that quality in order for it not to just be like a sermon or an essay. And it comes out of the culture of sermons and essays by adding ambivalence, which is what freaks out Samuel Johnson, because he's like, too much ambivalence. That's dangerous. You should just always be telling them, don't do it, right?
Right.
And Swift has a lot more ambivalence than Defoe, I think. What do you think of that?
I think that's right. I think he has a little bit more trust in his reader. When you write something satirical, you always have to trust your reader a little bit. Of course, there are people who, of course, notoriously misinterpreted Swift for a long time, and taken him very literally. But yeah, I think that that's another aspect, I think, of the history of the novel that doesn't quite get enough attention is the satirical side of it. That's how Henry Fielding starts. And again, with humor, it involves kind of expecting a little bit more of your readers. And despite Samuel Richardson's preface to Clarissa, where he sort of gives you the moral lesson that trust a rake, there is something, and Jane Austen, of course, takes this to an extreme. There is something attractive about a rake. The book would not be readable if there wasn't. We wouldn't. we have to sort of enter into at least Mary Ann's perspective on Willoughby, for instance, in order to understand the book.
But that's why he wrote Sir Charles Grandison, right? Because his rake was too successful.
That's right. Yeah.
What did Ian Watt get wrong about the novel?
I don't like to characterize it as being wrong. We tend not to think this way in literary criticism or in literary studies. But I like the scientific perspective on it, that he made sort of the first foray into noticing that there was something unusual going on here, something that was, going to lead to the later developments that we saw in the novel with Richardson, Fielding, and Defoe. And then, more people come along and they sort of pick at the theory and challenge it a little bit. But I think that's his sort of big innovation, is just noticing that these three writers had something in common. I have trouble, as I've sort of been talking about, putting Defoe in the same category as Richardson in particular. It just seems like they're kind of doing something a little bit different. But at the same time, it's a scientific classification. It's like Defoe was noticing the kingdom, and then other people were coming along and noticing the species. And that's that was a valuable contribution. There's what I really love about Ian Watt is that he's so readable, and I know that we've talked about this before.
Yes.
But one of the big problems with literary criticism is that with structuralism and post-structuralism and movements like that, it just becomes unreadable. And a lot of the later contributions to the field, if you can, you're in a good spot if you can actually just figure out what they're saying. Watt might sacrifice a little bit of nuance, but he does it for the sake of clarity.
He also often is actually quite nuanced, and I think the way he gets used, particularly more in magazine reviews, bluntens what he says. Like I've seen him brought out to justify the idea that the novel is entirely secular and stuff. And actually he's not really, he does get quite nuanced about how secular it is and isn't. He is capable of that nuance.
Yeah.
Why did the epistolatory novel die as a form?
Well, I don't think it's dead.
It lost its dominance and it's not coming back, right?
I don't know. You could argue that a lot of the first-person novels today are kind of a sort of descendant of that, and of course there have been attempts to revive that style, particularly in my chosen genre, the mystery field. There's these wonderful new novels by this British writer named Janet Hallett, who basically tells all of her stories in emails and other communications with people, and I really like that. But as for how it kind of becomes the free indirect discourse or free indirect style. I think it has to do something with Adam Smith and with Scottish philosophy at the time, which was, there's some evidence that Jane Austen actually read Adam Smith, at least a little bit, and just the sort of way of that leaked out, from philosophy to more general discourse about, how we interpret people, and how we enter into their perspective. But, I think that a lot of it has to do something with the criticism of Richardson. A lot of the criticism of Richardson was exactly the sort of thing that I was talking about earlier. People were like, well, he may have put that sort of preface on there to distance himself from his creation, but the fact was that he was portraying, fairly scandalous happenings. This is, I think, even more than Clarissa, his first book, Pamela, came in for that kind of criticism. It's about a maidservant who successfully, refuses her master in his sexual advances before, convincing him to marry her, and in good faith and all of that. And people found this scandalous in a number of ways. It's a very emotionally overwrought novel. It's, Twilight's got nothing on it. It's very, it's like almost like the first romantasy or something like that. Pamela has a lot of feelings, and a lot of them are very untamed. Despite the fact that she's putting them in letters, and I think that was really the source of the scandal. She's supposedly got the distance of letters, and she's writing these facts, but the letters that she writes are so immediate and so to the moment. That was how Richardson was writing to the moment, and they are, full of overwrought and highly charged language. And actually, one of the interesting complaints, I think this was actually Samuel Richardson's complaint, was how could a maidservant write so well? So there was the class complaint, there was the sex complaint, there was also just the fantastical element of it complaint that, what country squire would be interested in some silly little maid. And so there are all these criticisms of Pamela. It really became, what some people in English called a media moment. And then with Clarissa, I think he kind of learned his lesson a little bit and decided, well, first of all, I'm not just going to write these letters one-sided from one person. Pamela's mostly written just from Pamela's perspective in letters. So with Clarissa, he opens up the field. There's letters from Clarissa. There's letters from her wannabe seducer. There's letters from his friend. There's all sorts of people writing to each other, and so you get kind of a more balanced, broad perspective on this world. Although even in the letters themselves, there's kind of a you can tell who the good characters are and who the bad characters are, and there's kind of a merging of how they express themselves, and what their sort of moral characters are. Clarissa's brother and sister are notoriously horrible writers. They write in slang. Her family wants her to marry this guy, and she exchanges some letters with him, and he's just clearly an ignoramus. So you can kind of develop a feeling about these things. But I would say that dispersal of the narrative into multiple perspectives, even if you can kind of tell where characters stand by how they write, paves the way for free and direct discourse.
Right.
And eventually there's this imposition of the narrator, but the narrator isn't, the narrator of a fable who's constantly intruding to tell you what he or she thinks. The narrator is more like a referee, offering you all of these perspectives, sort of slightly dipping into people's minds, and then coming out of it. I think trying to embody where you're supposed to stand. But where you're supposed to stand also becomes pretty ambiguous as well. In that Smithian way, where we're sort of half entering into somebody else's perspective and then remembering that we can't really do that our senses will never carry us beyond our own persons, etc.
How well do we understand free and direct style?
I wish I understood it better. It's a term that gets thrown around a lot. It's, some people have argued that this is actually when going back to the beginning of our conversation, that this is actually when the novel starts. I don't think that's right. I think that, the novel clearly starts slightly earlier than that, with, Richardson and all these people who didn't really write in free and direct style.
Yeah.
But there's a way in which you can see the line. So, what's the definition of free and direct style? It's that kind of ambiguous perspective. It's you don't quite know where you stand. And that not knowing where you stand definitely helps create that ambiguity that you're talking about.
But isn't it striking that we've been having formal study of this for a century, and there are still live debates about what exactly free and direct style is doing? Is it collapsing the distance between the narrator and the character? Is it purposefully maintaining that distance? It's weird to me that we haven't settled these basic questions yet.
I think it's not that surprising, really, because we have such different relationships with characters in novels, and I have to say that I don't find it very convincing that it collapses the distance between us. I think that's kind of exactly the wrong way of thinking about it. I think it creates a greater distance between us and characters. There's something about epistolatory, for instance, that really, I think, kind of forces you to inhabit the perspective of the letter writer, or think about yourself alternately as the receiver of a letter. And I think that's kind of the innovation from Pamela to Clarissa, is that you start thinking about, well, what would I think about this if I received that letter from somebody? I would have to sort of partially enter into their perspective about what they were thinking, but I also have to think about myself as the receiver of the letter, and remember that I'm a separate person. And, letters always involve some kind of entreaty, a request. Even when they're almost purely informational, their request is to ask you to sympathize. And with free and direct discourse, I think what we're doing is we're just sort of taking that request for granted in a way, or we're not necessarily thinking about being entreated in quite the same way. In fact, the entreaty becomes more naturalized. It just becomes sort of part of our cognitive process somehow.
What is the role of fan fiction in the history of the novel?
I think fan fiction it's just a kind of desire to continue the story in your own way. I was, for other reasons, reading Camille Paglia's thoughts about Star Wars the other day, and she talks a little bit about the incredible world of fan fiction that Star Wars has inspired. And she says that she thinks that it has to do something with the economy of its narration. Some character will visually have a scar or something like that. And so someone has to come along and create, a backstory for that scar. And I think that there's something about, early novels that did the same thing. There was a desire, sometimes there was a desire for things to turn out differently than they did. And then sometimes there was just a desire to take up minor characters and try to figure out what their relationship to the story was. And of course, Jane Austen has just, inspired a great deal of continuation of fan fiction, by a number of notable authors even.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite?
I kind of love P.D. James's Death with Pemberley.
Yeah, same. I thought that was actually a very good book.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
it wanted something about the characters that one of the interesting things is I think it made Wickham more interesting to me. Wickham is of course in this long line of Austen rakes. But for me, he's one of the flatter ones. I've always preferred Willoughby when it comes to that category. I think because he has that scene in the book, which is unfortunately cut out of most of the movies, where he confers with Eleanor and sort of explains himself. And
yes,
yeah. Wickham, I don't know. At least in Pride and Prejudice, he's kind of a flatter villain. It's just kind of somebody, a ne'er-do-well, who just never manages to get himself together.
Were people in the 18th century actually right to worry that fiction was morally corrupting? Like, did they have a point?
I think maybe the question is, what do you mean by morally corrupting? I think. I mean, people still make this argument today about fiction. I remember sort of living through the, Twilight is turning all girls into little dish rags who can't stand up for themselves. And I think that there's behind that claim is a suspicion of readers, a suspicion that you maybe know too much about how they will interpret something. I mean, maybe this goes back to Smith in a way, that we never really can know exactly how people think or feel about a work of literature. I think, and we've talked about this before too, that Hume is more worried about that than Smith is. Hume is worried about emotional contagion. He's worried that, if you read Pamela, you're going to feel all those overwrought things that Pamela does. And I think Smith comes along and he's like, well, I don't know. I think people are a little bit more subtle and nuanced about the way that they interpret fiction. I think that they never really fully enter into the perspective of a fictional character. I mean, there were some worries, I think, in the 18th century that fictional characters were somehow easier to inhabit than real people because they weren't real. They were limited to what was on the page. And, so that might be behind some of the moral contagion worry. But I think Smith would have said, well, even fictional characters have some boundaries from us. And maybe fan fiction isn't a way of, sort of a digging into those boundaries or an attempt to get rid of those boundaries in some ways. But I think that I guess I'm on Smith's side. I think that the worry about, moral contagion or even the contagion of feelings is always premised on the idea that, that other people are kind of permeable and that fictional characters can enter them and that you can enter them and know what they're feeling and thinking. People make all sorts of interesting uses in their own lives of literature and things that you wouldn't expect. And that's not to say that every interpretation of fiction is the correct one, but sort of the nature of fiction is that it's infinitely expandable.
Uh-huh. How do we know that Jane Austen read Adam Smith?
So there was a book in her father's library that digested sort of important philosophical figures in the 18th century. The Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations both had kind of entries in there, and they had little excerpts, and the anthology was sort of the great 18th century form in a way. There's a lot of excerpting. And so I don't think that she, it's possible she read the whole thing. I don't think it's all that likely. But on the other hand, there is so much in Jane Austen that just seems entirely out of Smith. And so whether she had it directly or whether she had it through sort of secondhand sources, I think that it's very clear that she was thinking about things in much the same way that Adam Smith did.
To me, it seems inconceivable that she didn't read at least the whole of the Theory of Moral Sentiments.
Really?
I think there are so many little parallels. Don't you?
Well, yeah, and there's a lot of even echoing of language sometimes. Yeah. I mean, I've written about the rich man's son and how that kind of comes up in the conversation about Willoughby between Eleanor and Marianne and their mother.
I think you could make a strong case that the whole of Sense and Sensibility is kind of about that passage.
Yeah, I think so.
Right?
Yeah.
I don't think can that really be based on an anthology extract? That doesn't seem right to me.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm playing the cautious scholar here and not wanting to not wanting to go too far with a claim, but yeah, I mean, I would find it hard to believe that she hadn't at least read that part, and that part, really did get anthologized and excerpted a lot because people found it very interesting. I still find it interesting.
But she talks about
scare somebody. Yeah.
She talks about Eleanor having self-command. I don't remember what the number is, but like a dozen times or more.
No.
That can't, once you see all of the little connections, to me it's like I'm being asked to believe in a lot of coincidences. Or no, she just read the book. Well,
I mean, self-command is a concept, of course, that got brought up a lot in the 18th century in religious literature, in philosophical literature, in all sorts of guides for young people about how to conduct themselves.
But what I mean is that each individual thing can be explained away. But the fact that there's such an accumulation of Smithian things.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, and to support your argument, the Theory of Moral Sentiments wasn't a philosophical textbook in the way that we would think about philosophy textbooks now, or the abstruse writings of some Scandinavian or something like that. It was read by ordinary people. It was meant for ordinary people. The Wealth of Nations less so, actually, but even then, and I don't think that you find. I'd have a harder time making the argument that Jane Austen read The Wealth of Nations.
Indeed,
Theory of Moral Sentiments, I find somewhat plausible.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. So then, how important is Smith to her work? How well can we understand her without Smith?
Well, I think that we can understand her without Smith. People have been understanding her without Smith for a long time. But I think that Smith definitely helps enhance our understanding. It helps enhance our understanding of what she's getting at in Sense and Sensibility, especially because, the categories that she's talking about there, the self-command, the sensibility, but by sensibility, she means something like, feeling and and particularly that kind of intense Marianne like feeling. These are things that Smith wrote about. These are things that a lot of people were interested in at the time. How do you? And I think that there's a tension in Smith that's kind of interesting and comes up a lot in that book is how do you not become so alienated from feeling? How do you? There's something that Smith finds a little bit troubling, I would say, about the most rigorous kind of self-command. There's that section, I think it's in the very beginning of the book, where you almost have to see the tear dripping from the otherwise stoic face to know what's really going on. And in order to really feel, or in order to sense that somebody's feeling something deeply.
Yes.
And of course, we know throughout Sense and Sensibility, because we're allowed to inhabit Eleanor quite a bit, that she feels deeply, despite Marianne's accusations that she doesn't. But it's only when she can kind of show that to other characters that we can feel that they are joining in our sympathy for her. And I think that's one of the most interesting things about the book, really. And I think it's a tension, like I said, that comes up in Smith all the time. How do you show somebody that you're being stoic? A perfect stoicism ultimately doesn't let anybody see that there are any deep feelings under it. And he had a lot of criticisms of stoicism just for that reason.
Do you think that Jane Austen was a capitalist in any sense? Was she in favor of the commercial society and the changes that were happening?
This is a subject of great debate in Austen studies. Was she a conservative? Was she a liberal? Obviously those terms are a little bit, especially when we think about them in our sort of 21st century. They're fairly anachronistic.
But there is a long-standing debate. Like, is she an anti-Jacobin conservative, or is she an Enlightenment liberal of some description? Yeah.
Yeah. And then there's the school that says that she just deliberately avoided politics, the sort of Said school of things. I'm not sure from reading her. I've read a fair number of her letters, correspondence with other people. I just don't know if she was all that interested in identifying one way or the other. She seemed mostly interested, as she told her niece, in these little tiny communities that she almost described it as like scrimshawing. And I think that was really where her interest, her main interest lay. I think that in a way goes along with her sort of Smithian sense. I don't know that Smith was considered himself all that political either. He was definitely sort of conversant with some of the sort of major philosophical movements of his time, and he was in favor of the American Revolution, of course. But it just wasn't really what animated him. He was also interested in human nature, and the people who argue that he was a conservative or that Jane Austen was a conservative ultimately end up going back there, I think, and saying, well, an interest in human nature is inherently conservative, and the Enlightenment liberal is the one who seeks to change human nature. I don't know. I call myself an Enlightenment liberal, and I'm interested in human nature too.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is Mansfield Park about slavery?
God. No.
Really?
No, I don't think so. I certainly not. It's certainly not about chattel slavery in the Caribbean. Maybe it's about different kinds of forms of slavery. it's always been, as the kids say, problematic for me to base an argument about a book on an absence of something there. And Mansfield Park is, people who like Austen usually don't like Mansfield Park for some reason. I don't know why. I think it's about Fanny. I think that book is about Fanny. It's about how she relates to her, to these odd circumstances of her upbringing. And the stuff about slavery that, of course, Edward Said notoriously brought into the conversation is just not very present on the page. And she just spends so much more time examining the sort of moral categories that Fanny is working with. What do you think it's about?
I agree with you, and I find it curious that more people don't like Fanny. I think she's the greatest heroine of all the Austen heroines. I think she's a really wonderful character, and I think there's a great lineage through the 19th century novel of Fanny Price type characters. But I think the novel clearly is, to some great degree, about slavery. The first thing I would always say before writing that would be there were other novels that were, in fact, about slavery. And if Jane Austen wanted to do that, she would have done. It's an affront to her genius to assume that she couldn't have written a slavery novel if she wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, there are too many little things in the book.
Okay.
But I do think that most of the modern scholarship overreads it. And it's very selective. And I don't know if you read that Helena Kelly book,
no,
Jane Austen, The Secret Radical. It's a terrible book. You shouldn't read it. But
I did read that book.
Yeah.
Okay.
It does make a reasonably good case, actually. I think the Mansfield Park chapter is pretty good. But, for example, Samuel Johnson is wheeled in as the great abolitionist, and no argument with that. But clearly, to my mind, the reason why the idler is on Fanny's table is because Johnson loves hierarchy and obedience. And that is exactly what the Bertram children are missing, and it's what Fanny and Edmund do have. And if you're going to read the slavery, and you also have to read hierarchy and obedience in, and so I think it makes a complicated picture.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think something new has been discovered about that book. Edward Said was wrong in a productive way, is maybe a way of putting it.
Yeah.
But she wasn't you sometimes see people writing about her like she would have been a good Democrat, or she would have been woke or something. And I think that's wrong, clearly wrong.
Well, I think it's a book about, like I said, I think that there's an argument that it's a book about freedom. Fanny could very easily sort of just give in to her uncle about her marriage. And I think it's about her in the most sort of broad sense, discovering her own liberality, her own judgment, learning to invest in herself. And that's why I think that she's such a great heroine. I don't, I don't find anything particularly scandalous about Lover's Vows, I have to say. It seems very tame. But the fact that she's willing to sort of commit to her judgment on that, and commit to a sort of nuance about what's going on when that play is being considered by the Bertram children. She knows things that her uncle doesn't know about the relationships that are happening there. I mean, it's a case of reading. It's a case of a perfect reading of a situation, the perfect way that literature does map on to the lives of these people around her. And of course, she is a great reader and an aspiring historical writer.
Is she an evangelical?
Oh, good. Oof. I'm not even. I'm not sure how to begin answering that question. I don't think so. I think she's religious. I think that. But I think that she does have kind of a respect for authority, and for tradition. but I wouldn't necessarily call that evangelical at all. At least the sort of conceit of the modern evangelical movement is similar to the Protestant Anabaptists and the radicals of the 17th century, who thought that they could sort of interpret things directly without authority and without religion. So I don't know. She doesn't map on well to me at all in that respect.
You write about Adam Smith's ideas of rhetoric and imagination being central to the creation of fictional character. Is there something proto-romantic about Smith's view on this?
I don't think he would have described it that way, but I might. You know, I mean, it depends, I think, a lot on what you would define as romantic. But imagination is it is a central fact of his moral universe. There's our ability to imagine other people, to imagine situations outside the ones that you're familiar with.
It's maybe the central fact, right?
That's right. Yeah, moral imagination. And you know, it's something that he is not worried about. Imagination in Hume is almost an insult, but in Smith, it's sort of your central moral tool. And I think in a way, a lot of the Smith criticism has missed that, because people, especially philosophers, have been eager to read Smith as an extension of Hume in some ways. But you know, it always strikes me as interesting. So Hume, of course, biographically was this bon vivant, and he had this exciting sort of dramatic life, and he was kept out of university posts, traveled to France and met all of these famous French people, and, you know, even hosted Rousseau in his house for a little while. And Smith's life, of course, was so much more conventional and Calvinist almost. You know, he lived with his mother until she was a very advanced age, and he died shortly after she did, and probably because she wasn't caring for him anymore. And there are all these great stories about, you know, absent-minded Professor Smith. But Smith turns out to me to be the one who is more invested in kind of a romantic imagination, and you know, sort of imagining things dramatically, and not necessarily in a way that doesn't anchor ultimately in your own experience, because I think that he's very explicit about that too. That all our moral observations are anchored fundamentally in our own experience. But I often like to think, you know, he probably wouldn't have had a problem with science fiction and some of these other things. Hume definitely would have had a problem with.
How important is Smith as a literary critic?
I mean, I would say probably not as important as he should be. Probably because he towards the end of his life, actually, he was planning on turning the Lectures on Rhetoric and Bellette into a book.
Yeah.
But he never got around to it. And he famously asked for all of his papers to be burned, and he died. I think if he'd had time to revise the Lectures on Rhetoric into a formal document on literature, he would have had a lot of really interesting things to say. He clearly read novels. He definitely read Gulliver's Travels for sure. He talks about Gulliver a lot. I suspect he read Defoe. And, you know, he was just familiar with a lot of different, you know, sort of forms of literature throughout time. He was well read in the Greeks and the Romans, all sorts of classical literature, and contemporary literature. I think, you know, what's interesting about him is he's really able to see the sort of continuities between literary biography and literary criticism, which is a line we don't like to cross these days. But I think it's that's one of the strengths of his writings, is he talks about how the writer builds a character through their work.
We're very pro biography at the Common Reader. That's fine.
Yeah.
What did he learn from Swift? Obviously prose style and things like that, but on a deeper level.
I think that he's really interested in Swift as a satirist. And I think that why he's interested in that is because he is interested in the ways that we recreate writers' characters in our own heads. And like I said at the very beginning of this conversation, satire is something that really requires a lot of active reading. And it requires you to have, as a writer, a lot of trust in your reader. Smith was extremely interested in the relationship between, I think, writers and readers. And for that reason, Gulliver's Travels is a really interesting document to him. It's written kind of as a travelogue of all of these journeys to distant lands. And it requires the reader to kind of understand that what Gulliver is really talking about is of course, in any satire, his own world.
How does one write a good mystery novel?
Well, you need a mystery. That's the most important thing. A lot of people have asked me, why am I drawn to the genre? I think the reason I'm drawn to the genre is it's about human character and extremity. And it's about what we want. I took an economics class when I was an undergraduate, and I remember the professor walked into the room and he said, "Economics, it's about who we are and what we want." I'm like, "Okay, sold. I'm here for that." And of course, economic motives are a great source for mystery. People kill for all sorts of reasons, but maybe the most common and in some ways the most fundamental one is economic gain. And so that's why I kind of turned to that genre. I'm hoping one day to make Adam Smith a character in a mystery novel.
How do you read Hilary Mantel in the light of Hobbes' Leviathan?
I started out by thinking that the Wolf Hall trilogy was anti-Hobbesian in a way. That it's a tragedy about somebody who is a little bit too Hobbesian. That Cromwell is perhaps somebody who puts a little bit too much stock in authority and in the state. Even as he sort of undermines that with his ironic free and direct discourse commentary on how awful Henry VIII is in those books. But I did a virtual reading group on this for Liberty Fund. And the people who were in that group managed to convince me that it's not quite that simple. That there's a lot of ambiguity and ambivalence in Cromwell himself about the authority of the tutors. And as awful as Henry is responding to a problem, and Cromwell is able to see that. And he thinks in the sort of classic Machiavellian way that he's going to be able to manipulate the sovereign. And it doesn't quite end up working out for him. And I think, another interesting thing about those books is that he's very down on Machiavelli throughout them. And Machiavelli's mentioned a number of times in a very disparaging way. He just wrote down some things that everybody knows. Which is that's a novel reading of Machiavelli. I don't think any of Machiavelli's own contemporaries had that reaction to him for sure. I think that I think that it's post-Hobbesian in a way. It's working with a lot of Hobbesian terms. The whole trilogy is indebted to a lot of different kinds of political philosophy. I think they're just fascinating books for that reason. They're really a reflection on things that, you think, that the Tudor period is so distant from our own. But no, I think they have a lot to say about contemporary politics in the end.
On your website, it says that you're learning how to program in Python and fly planes. How's that going?
I've decided not to learn to program in Python because AI has
Yes.
created that. Although it's helpful to know a little bit of programming language. I think even now that the AI can write whatever Python codes we want. And I haven't been flying planes as much recently because I'm trying to finish writing my books. But I'm hoping to pick that back up. New Mexico is a great place to learn how to do that.
What appeals to you about flying?
Oh, it's the bird's eye view, obviously. It's the thing that we're not really supposed to have. It's looking down on the world, and getting to decide what you're looking down on. When you take a commercial flight, of course, you can have that experience, but there's something about being in control of the experience that's very appealing to me.
What will you do next?
Well, I have so many ideas for mystery novels. Somebody asked me recently, well, where do you get your ideas from? And it's the classic question you ask a writer. And my response is always, I don't know where you can go where you don't get ideas for a mystery novel. I can't go to a performance of the Children's Symphony and
indeed, yeah,
mystery novel. I really would like to venture a little bit more into historical mysteries. I am quite serious about that whole writing a historical mystery set in 18th century Edinburgh where Adam Smith is at least a minor character.
I would be so here for it.
And Hume too, because I think, in a way, Hume is the more interesting character, even if I prefer Smith's philosophy.
It would be easy to cast suspicion upon Hume.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking really what my ideal murder victim is some sort of publisher.
Sure.
Who's publishing things that the Presbyterians don't agree with.
What mystery novels do you particularly admire?
So I love speaking of the tutor, I love the Matthew Shardlake ones. C.J. Sansom. I think he recently died. But they're about a lawyer who's working for Cromwell, and who finds a lot of his sort of Cromwellian Protestant beliefs challenged. I already mentioned Janice Hallett. I really enjoy the return of epistolatory in mystery novels, and of course Dorothy Sayers wrote a great one called Documents in the Case, which is a sort of similar idea. I also really enjoy Alexander McCall Smith. I'll read anything with that guy. I can't believe that he's still alive. I realized that.
Oh yeah,
7-year-old daughter. And he wrote sort of an adaptation of the Precious from Lotway novels for kids. And that was her first fan letter. She wrote Alexander McCall Smith and asked him if she could just write some more of those because she loved them so much.
That's nice. Shannon Chamberlain, thank you very much.
Well, thanks for having me on the podcast. This has been great. Great conversation.
Yeah, it was delightful.